Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Aspect Insights. This is episode 13 of your favorite live stream and podcast about Bazel and its ecosystem. My name's Alex. I'm the co-founder at Aspect Build. We make a monorepo developer platform based on Bazel. And today I'm very excited to have with me a Googler from a long time ago, Mike Bland, who is his official title is Platform Architect of Developer Experience at EngFlow, although he sometimes likes to be called an instigator instead. Today we're going to be talking about Bzlmod. We did talk about this before on the show, so if you want to scroll back to episode 7, Fabian Murmertheim talked about some of the implementation bits of Bzlmod, and today what we're hoping to do is get a little bit more practical and help you to do the adoption, because Bazel 8 will be released very soon now, probably in the next couple of weeks, and the WORKSPACE support is disabled by default, so it's going to be the first time that you're really prompted pretty hard to go through with this migration. So with that, I'm really excited to welcome Mike to the show. Hello.
Howdy. Nice to be here. Thanks, Alex.
Oh, it's a thrill to have someone with your level of background and experience. You were at Google before me, and so I would love to, maybe we can start off. You tell us a little bit more. Give yourself more of an intro than I'm qualified to do.
Well, let's see. I was there from 2005 to 2011. I was there for the beginning of what was Blaze. I didn't work on it directly, but I was the first guy Johannes Hinkle told that he got something to build with Blaze after pulling an all-nighter. So I've got that going. But yeah, I was there till 2011. Also helped launch the internal remote caching execution platform there, integrated with Blaze. And then I did some other stuff here and there. And I was at a company called Cvent for a while here in Northern Virginia. Then I went to Apple for about 4 years, 2018 to 2022. And I've been at EngFlow since March 2024.
Yeah, it's awesome that you're back in the Bazel ecosystem after having been there. It's for the first commit, the first all-nighter commit. I would love, there's so many other topics we could probably talk about, but the first I heard of you when I started at Google was this testing grouplet. And a lot of companies, maybe today, most of us think that automated testing is obvious. I don't know if engineers actually feel that way, but back then it was not obvious. And convincing Googlers to do anything, back then it was a very bottoms-up kind of culture. And so it wasn't that like Larry and Sergey could say, write tests. It had to be you.
Yeah, well, interesting turn of phrase, because one of our biggest claims to fame was testing on the toilet, which is what you do when you get desperate to get people's attention.
Yeah,
to do something that now seems so widespread industry practice.
I wrote one of those, and I got one of these little toilets. Do you have one of these too?
I did, but
cool.
I lost it in a wildfire in California. But
oh, that's terrible. I'm so sorry.
Sorry, I wasn't going to bring that up, but that's yeah.
Okay, well, that's what happens when I go deviate from the script and ask other questions. Okay, so let's get to our topic for today then. So I think it's probably worth spending a couple minutes introducing Bzlmod again, just in case this is in case some listeners don't already know. And I feel like the most interesting question, especially since you were talking about the inception of Blaze, is like, why is Bzlmod a new thing if Blaze was around since 2006 or 7?
Yeah, well, I figured maybe you would know about this more than me, because you were there longer for sort of the introduction of what would become Bazel, the open source version. My understanding is, when you have an open source product, it needs to integrate with other, repositories and things. And Google just didn't have that. They had the monorepo where they checked everything into their own third-party directory. So, there was no, I guess, complexity around trying to play nice with other external packages and however they were configured and the tool chains they were compatible with and all that kind of stuff. So I think that's why, when it got open sourced and we wanted it, or we still say we, and, the Bazel project wanted it to be, I guess, more generally useful to a broader audience. They had to get something working, I presume. I wasn't there for it. But that's my understanding, is where version 1.0 WORKSPACE came into the picture. And then, of course, second system effect sets in, and that's, by the way, I've always been pronouncing it Bzlmod. That's how I've heard it, just so I'm not trying to enforce the pronunciation, but if I say it that way, I haven't heard Bzlmod yet.
Okay, well, this is a great reason for us to have a show with some audio and not just typing, because we get to find out different pronunciations. And yeah, some people ask me, is it pronounced Basil or Basil? And I just try to say, like, you pronounce it like we understand what you mean.
Mm.
Um, you mentioned vendoring into Google's monorepo, and yeah, that's the biggest like wow I think for everyone. And you mentioned tool chains also. Like, it's not just that they check in their node modules and their Python packages and whatever they use from package managers. They check in like the GCC source code, right? Like, it's the whole thing. It's insane.
Yeah.
And I think the way Google does monorepo sounds terrifying to people, because it is pretty terrifying, I think. Unless you have enough, the world's smartest engineers or whatever Googlers claim to be. And so, yeah, this is not the system everybody else wanted. And what they want is hopefully this new Bzlmod. Yeah, let's jump into like what's good about it, why they would want it, like what makes it easier to use.
Yeah. So, and by the way, I'll preface this by saying I hadn't really done that much Bazel until from the time I left, Google in 2011 until I joined InchFlow. I did play with it a little bit at Apple, because Simon Stewart was there, and I play with it a little bit with him. But the real deep dive I've done has been since March, April of this year. But my understanding is, WORKSPACE, I think, was a valiant attempt to get something out the door that started working. And there are still some WORKSPACE abstractions that remain in Bzlmod, like repository rules and HTTP archive. Like, those aren't going away. They're still part of Bzlmod. And with the right design, you can actually share some of these implementations. It's not like, if you maintain a rule set or anything like that, you have to throw everything away and start from scratch. With Bzlmod, you just might have some compatibility work to do.
Right, and
I think
they made that easier, right? Because like HTTP archive, you can still just use that in it. Like, they added this capability to make it easier to reuse the WORKSPACE file concepts.
Yeah, but I think what and it's probably familiar to everyone, that part of what made WORKSPACE a problem after a while is that it just executed everything sequentially. You can load things at any point. You can load something that something later on in the file depends upon, and so I think with that you got into ordering constraints. You had to be careful the order in which you did things, and it was still a little bit spooky action at a distance. All the repositories were imported into this global namespace, so things could get stomped on. WORKSPACE wouldn't tell you about it. There was just a lot of ambiguity that people discovered in practice.
Yeah,
and then
for rule set authors, that had an implication also, because rules Docker or rules proto, for example, have dependencies on a bunch of different languages. And so as a rule set author there, you're trying to be careful not to break people, but anytime you bump a dependency version, if somebody's listed you first in their WORKSPACE file, you could break them.
Yeah. Oh, and I'm going to circle back to why that problem still exists to some degree in Bzlmod. But in general, like the more I started learning about Bzlmod and its design and constraints, the more I was like, oh, this is really pretty cool. And a big thing for me, and big part of why I was compelled to help launch the Forge, the remote caching execution platform back in the day at the old company, is in order to make use of it, you had to clean your stuff up, right? And so this is sort of a similar case that I see, where Bzlmod has many advantages, but you might have some work to do before you can even turn it on and start using it. But once you've made those changes, you are definitely in a much better state, and it's going to be more difficult to sort of backslide out of that. So that's part of why I'm particularly engaged by the work of Bzlmod migration.
Yeah. And it's not just that it helps you with your dependencies, but also there's like toolchain registration that can be tucked into the module file for one of the libraries you use. So, for example, the Bazel lib foundation library has like some helper utilities that are fetched as toolchains. All that registration can also be done conveniently for you, and participates in this Bzlmod thing.
Yeah, and the burden does land on the rules authors to do that. And we'll talk about little bit later, that's kind of what I've been doing with rule Scala, is doing some of that toolchain abstraction. Because I think something else about WORKSPACE is the burden was on the consumer. Like, oh, here's some macros. Make sure you call these to configure our repo that you're importing. Whereas with Bzlmod, the module.bazel from that module, that repo, can do a lot of the configuration for you, and then expose just some basic API for configuring some key parameters. And so I think that's also a really interesting development. It really does become easier for the user, and because the model under Bzlmod is to like collect all this metadata from the entire dependency graph to say who needs what configured which way, and then it will execute module extensions that will instantiate repositories in a separate namespace that you don't need to know about and won't pollute your other modules or the rest of your project. It's just a really cool design, I think, and interesting to see it happen.
Yeah. Yep, I agree. So maybe let's talk about the next topic, which is how Bzlmod interacts with package managers. Of course, it has its own. You can consider it to be a package manager for Starlark modules in a sense, and so it has its own things that package managers have, like a registry, a public registry where everyone can contribute these. You can also make your own private registries. So let's just remind everybody how that interacts with the language-specific package managers they had already, right? Because the goal is, for the most part, we're not trying to replace those.
Right. As a matter of fact, it's a case of, an extra level of abstraction solving all problems, right? Like, so if you're configuring a build, you're, configuring modules with Starlark code. But under the hood, the rules authors providing those modules have done the work of, trying to invoke npm, mypi, go, get, whatever. That those rules modules will do the translations to the other package managers, and there's some complexity there. But at least the way the ecosystem is supposed to work is like trust the people providing the Starlark abstraction for like the Python registry to get it right, and then you as a consumer do not have to fiddle with all the requirements files and different configuration files and things like that.
Yeah. All right. So, maybe what are some of the things about the Bazel Central Registry that are useful for people to know, like how it works or like how you interact with it?
Yeah, I think one of the neat things is there's really not a lot to it. Like, you go to registry.bazel.build, I believe it is, and you search for your module and say what version is out there, and it has a little snippet for you to copy and paste Bazel dep into your Bzlmod, and also has a convenient link to the repo if you want to go further into the documentation for that package. It's pretty lightweight, and I also think it's neat that it's essentially, as I understand it, like just a static JSON file or collection of JSON files, and the spec is in Bazel.build. The documentation site tells you what the spec is. So if you wanted to do your own version, if you needed to be, if you had increased levels of scrutiny around security, or you were in an air-gapped environment or something like that, you can still use the same essential mechanism, just pointed at a different implementation. I think that's rather powerful as well.
Yeah. The simplest one is if you make a fork of that GitHub repo, you can use the -- registry flag on the command line to point to like raw.githubusercontent.com/your fork, essentially, and GitHub will serve an HTTP site that has that structure, and therefore the Bazel client knows what to do. Yeah. And I know there's a couple of things ongoing worth mentioning.
I forgot one other thing. One other nice thing is, like, when you've got a proper Bazel dependency, you generally don't have to, let me go to the repo and get the stanza with the HTTP archive and the SHA-SUM for this version, and then the macros I have to, order right in my workspace. It's just like, no, here's the Bazel dep, here's the version, off to the races. So I really appreciate the API they put in place for that. And of course, with the module extensions, you do have capability to exert control over the configuration, but it's not like it's imposed upon you in a very fragile way like WORKSPACE unfortunately had.
Yeah, I think you mentioned the SHA-256. So obviously something has changed that you no longer have to put that in your file, and we don't want anybody to worry. There are still guarantees. So one of the guarantees is that Bazel will always, unless you pass a flag telling it not to, it will create a lock file for everything that it fetched, which will be sort of trust on first use, is this notion of like, it'll download it and calculate the SHA, and then it will make sure that it stays the same so that no attacker can come and change the packages after the fact. Also, the Bazel Central Registry itself, at least the primary fork that the Bazel team and some of us in the community are maintaining, has some immutability guarantees. So that once something is published, if you point to Rules Go version 045, like that's not going to change. And then there's some work going on. I actually have a meeting later this morning about adding provenance attestations so that when you download pre-built archives of the rule sets that are pointed to by the Bazel Central Registry, you're also guaranteed that those were built from the sources that it says they were.
Right.
So it's a pretty good guarantee that Bazel gave you before, and like that guarantee is still there and getting better, I think, is the summary.
Yeah, and it's less work. I mean, less work as a consumer.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think the reason that I knew you were working on this is that you wrote some great blog posts that we mentioned actually before on the show, I think. So maybe tell us a little bit about like how you got into working on Bzlmod. You mentioned that since you started at EngFlow, you got the chance to come back into Bazel and learn stuff about it. So I assume you were doing some internal migrations and like I mean, how did you come to be the expert on this?
Accidentally. My whole career can be described as a series of accidents. So yeah, I was new at EngFlow, and I really, like I said, I hadn't done much with Bazel at all. I'd left Google in 2011 and only tinkered with it here and there. But along the way, I somehow was reading up on it and saw, oh, there's this new Bzlmod thing that's going to replace WORKSPACE. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. Do we have that? Because we have a mono repo. Me and a couple of colleagues, Yannick and Yuval, just published a repo. It's not Bzlmod related, but published a blog post. God, my head is still in Bzlmod. About evaluating different remote execution platforms and things. And I've got a script that says, oh, we ran this, and this kind of shows you the scope of our repo. It has all these different languages and things like that in it. So I was like, well, it'll take some time for me to get up to speed on the system and do any work of critical path substance. But hey, nobody's working on this Bzlmod thing. And so I just kind of threw it out in the Slack channel. It's like, anybody mind if I take a stab at this? And nobody, screamed at me not to touch it. So I took that as implicit permission to go forth. And I did. And man, it was an adventure. It was a fun adventure. It's the kind of adventure I enjoy. I like, taking things and figuring out why they're not working and make them better, especially sort of like what I was saying earlier with, when I helped launch remote execution at Google. The process was, well, a lot of these problems are basically where our build is a little fast and loose with the details, right? And we need to, improve how we declare run files and how we pass in, certain target paths and things of that nature. And so it was a lot of little things that, WORKSPACE and that model didn't enforce. But under Bzlmod, it's sort of like, well, you get these guarantees of correctness and, better performance down the line, and you can reason about it. But to do that, to take advantage of the new hotness, you got to clean up the old and busted stuff. And so it just turned into like this incredible journey of discovery. And also I was like, hey, I'm learning and fixing all these problems. And these are problems that a bunch of other people at EngFlow, many of whom used to work on Bazel or were otherwise heavily involved in the ecosystem, they didn't know about this stuff, or they hadn't already done anything about it. And I'm like, well, if the migration is taking this much work, which I don't mind doing, but how are our customers and our prospective customers and others in the community when they're being told to migrate and they're hitting all these problems, maybe they don't have the luxury of time and familiarity and or just pure, intrinsic tenacity when it comes to these kind of problems to sit down and solve them. And so I was thinking like, wow, these people are going to be locked on like Bazel 7 or maybe 8 forever while we're on Bazel 15, because the migration for them was a bit challenging. So I figured, you know what, let me try to take what I've done and share what I know, and hopefully it'll prove useful to the broader community.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate you. One of my managers at Google, John Micco, like to say, you just show an engineer running water and they'll just naturally start building a dam. And so like you saw something that needed to happen and jumped in to do it. I agree that like there's this thing about iPhone versus Android, where one of the big advantages of iPhone is that they're able to sort of lockstep move the ecosystem forward. And with Android, you have all these old phones and carriers who have old versions. And like, it's a little similar that for Bazel and for our ecosystem, if we end up with users who are stuck on Bazel 7 forever, or Bazel 8 with the -- enable workspace flag, we're going to be in a fragmented situation where we have to support users on those old things. And now they're using versions of rules that are 2 years old and everything has changed, and we'll never make sense of it. The cognitive load will be too high. So as an ecosystem, we have to get everybody past this migration. Right.
Yeah. And I said, and the company was like, hey, that's valuable. Do it. And so I have the good fortune of being able to spend a good chunk of time on it.
Yeah, that's awesome. It's a great contribution. Our companies have to figure out ways to justify investing in things like that, and yeah, moving the ecosystem forward is fantastic. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, I guess the blog posts have been great. I probably many people listening have already read them. You should read them if you haven't. Do you have more coming there? I mean,
I do.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So I guess I'll talk a little bit about sort of my thought process around this series, because I should have it up right here. When was the last time I published? The last one of those came out September 6th. And so those first few blog posts were hidden knowledge or other little details that are useful to know, that you can sort of take into your own hands right away in your own project and fix little problems, things like, the main repository label is now double @ instead of single @ and, little things like that. Or, maybe you're depending on a repository name and maybe you see that you don't have to, and you sort of take that out of the code in some way. And then it moved into like run files libraries and using them right, and knowing in the Python case which one to use, because there's one that ships with Bazel still that will break under Bzlmod, but you should be using the one in rules Python. So I decided, let's do an episode just on run files libraries, and I tried to make that a fairly complete technical document. And that's the other thing. They're blog posts, but they're really, nobody's going to sit down and read those beginning to end for pleasure, right? Like they're more.
Right. No, it's more like a knowledge base. Yeah, it makes sense. Just that blogging is an easier, less committed format where you can put part of it, and the rest of it you'll get to it.
Yeah.
For run files, of course, the thing there is that you are now forced to have your repository named _main instead of whatever it used to be named, and so that broke some of your hard-coded paths.
Right.
Those before. So yeah, and then, the run files helper gives you an abstraction to avoid having to know what the thing is named.
Yeah. And it's funny, in that case, I had done all this work. I was like, oh, we have to change all these run file paths to _main. And then later I found, I dug up, maybe I should put this in the notes too. I dug up a GitHub issue where I found Tony Aiuto, who I still have to reach out to him. He was one of the testing grouplet New York members back in the day. And now he maintains rules package and things like that. And I saw him in a thread with Richard L. I'm afraid I won't be able to pronounce his Lavasseur if I'm
Sounds
in the
right.
ballpark. And in that conversation, it kind of came up that, oh no, you should be using the rules Python run files library. And I'm like, what? And sure enough, I go back and use the right run files library, and I undid all my underscore main path update. So stuff like that I wanted to get out there, like, so people don't go down a particular path where they're not wrong about, yeah, oh, you know what the problem is and you're applying a solution, but really the better solution is this other thing.
Yeah.
Same thing with, and speaking of Tony, I know he maintains rules package, and that was the third blog post. And that was born of the fact that everything was building fine with Bzlmod, but then we found out that some of the packages we repackaged and were deploying on our systems were silently broken. And it had to do with the way, you know, we had our build interacting with rules package. So I was like, well, we can't be the only ones. And so I wanted to share, you know, what we call holding it right. I got that term from my colleague Corbin, where, you know, rules package is perfectly compatible if you use it this way. You know, if you're relying on what are actually technically deprecated features of that package, then that's where you get into trouble.
Yeah. All right. Well, what about, so there's a transitive nature of this, right? So there's also sort of, you fix your project now, but other people's projects are not fixed. You know, I mean, a year ago, Bzlmod existed, but it was too early to use, largely because the ecosystem wasn't there. So what do you do about sort of patching versus contributing when the problem is not in your code?
Oh yeah, and that's that's what I'm in the middle of now. So a couple things. I should say that, like, the vast majority of our dependencies were lift and shift. Like, they were just HTTP archive calls, or, you know, they were already, you know, properly designed Bazel modules out there and we could just do it. But, you know, 80-20 rule, it's that last 20 or however much it is where you have to dig in and do the work. And so that's going to be the subject of the next blog post. Like, well, the problem is in your dependency, what do you do? And I'm going to talk about, one, writing your own module extension to wrap a package, and two, get into situations where you might have to write a patch and how you would go about doing that, and the kind of problems, examples of the kind of problems you might hit. And the reason it's been so delayed is I've been making a trade-off up to this point of I actually got our projects to work by doing these things and maintaining patches and whatnot. But there was always a part of me that was like, well, could I push this upstream? And in the case of rule Scala, there was a discussion on it in Slack one day at InchFlow. And again, my colleague Jay, we got in a topic about you know, this. And I said, well, I got rule Scala to work with the InchFlow example GitHub project. And, you know, maybe I could contribute something. And of course, he appealed to my vanity and said, you might be the best person in the position to do it. And I'm like, great, you got nerd sniped into this. And so I started, you know, looking at the threads. I saw attempts other people had made, and then I sort of tried to politely jump in and say, would anybody mind if I took a shot at it? And I also had been experimenting with it, and I got it working in sort of like this one branch. But since then, you know, it's been, well, one, it's been a wonderful process. It's been how open source is supposed to work, you know, because I basically got a, you know, proof of concept going. I asked permission, people were receptive, the maintainers, and then I started carving off pieces of it. And some of the pieces, you had mentioned this in your interview with Fabian, were like, well, we need to get ready for Bazel 7 because it's still building with Bazel 6. And I found out that with these little tweaks, you know, you can build under both. And I started sending them those updates, and then other little cleanups, refactorings, tools, things of that nature. And now we're getting to the point where the actual substantial design work is going in. So it's been a really fun project for me to just kind of get in there and figure out these problems and solve them, and to work with the maintainers of Rule Scala. I need to make sure I'm looking at their names so I can pronounce them right. I should have had this up already, but yeah, they've just been wonderful with not only reviewing my changes, but also pushing back when, you know, there's something they're concerned about, and or making suggestions, you know, improvements to things. It's definitely, that's how pull requests are supposed to work. You know, I wasn't going to take like my working branch and send them like 5,000, well, more than 5,000 when you consider, module lock files. But, I wasn't going to send them like this one, earth shattering pull request and say, merge me. I wanted to make sure that these different little pieces got the attention they deserved, that everybody was aligned. Oh, yep, I understand. This is what needs to happen. This is why this works. And then to get feedback on the pieces of it so that I can make improvements as I go. And it's been a wonderful process.
Yeah, I hope that we can encourage everyone who contributes to open source to learn those lessons. It's also partly those contributors are volunteering. They don't have very much time, and if you send them something big, there's just never a period of time where they have a whole hour to look at a big PR.
Right. Exactly.
You have to somehow fit your work into the time slices that they could that you think they can make available, and their time slices are probably smaller than you think, because somebody maintaining something like that. I don't know those folks either, but that's a lot of work.
Yeah. It's Simonas and Vidas. And out of respect, I want to say Vidas Pilkauskas and Simonas Pinavicius. I'm self-conscious, as most Americans are about mispronouncing, but at least I made an attempt. But yeah, they've been, and then actually one of the Scala compiler maintainers, a guy named Wojciech Mazur, noticed what I was doing, and he started, commenting on my pull requests and making some really helpful suggestions. And then we coordinated like things he was trying to land with things that it's just, sometimes you think of the open community, it can be a harsh place sometimes, but man, it's been just a pleasure working on this, and taking the time is not a problem. I'm not in a rush. I'm not trying to force things through. I'm not trying to pull a XZ situation on them. And in the end, I think we're going to have, the next major release of this thing not only be Bzlmod ready, but just be, and it's still going to be WORKSPACE compatible. And it's going to be, I think, a great upgrade to everybody in the community working with Scala and Bazel.
Yeah, that's great. I think Scala is one of the last ones I know of. I mean, the Bazel Central Registry has ton of modules on it already. We should point out, if you want to add more, there used to be a poll that Yun put up on a GitHub discussion, and now that's been closed, and there's simply a process of creating an issue on the Bazel Central Registry if there's a module that's missing, and it will add a module wanted tag to it. You can see the module wanted tags on the registry now. There are a long tail of those, partly because of, we said earlier how Bzlmod is meant to work with existing package managers, but then there's C++. And so it kind of accidentally became a package manager for C++, where everybody has put patches that add the build files, that add the CC library targets. And so a bunch of the module wanted, a bunch of these modules really don't have any Starlark code. They're not rules. They're, just how do I build the C++ library? Whatever. Unfortunate accident. It's probably going to stay that way. I just complain about it every chance I get. I'm sorry. I can't help myself.
Well, there has to be a little bit of that. I think there's, and I was planning on maybe bringing this up closer to the end, but I think, as someone who at this point is obviously deeply invested in rooting for Bzlmod to succeed and wants to help people get there, there are still a couple of warts, and we need to be honest about what those are and what we need to do to work around them today, and what we might need to do to remove them as blockers for some portion of the audience.
Yeah, well, let's talk through some of those. You mentioned the at earlier. So there's this concept of canonical and apparent repository names. So you have to be careful to get those right. And of course, the problem with error messages is they sort of get lazy evaluated. So error messages will look like, I couldn't find a label called open square bracket at no such thing, close square bracket. And then like, it's just, it's pretty baffling. So what do you do about those? Do I just add the other ats? Like I change all my ats to at? I have done that in a couple spots.
Yeah. I mean, in some cases, that's exactly what you need to do. In some cases, well, I wrote a whole, the last blog post that came out was all about dealing with trying not to depend directly on a repository name because of the canonical versus apparent abstraction. And so I try to, present if you're in this situation, this is what you can do, or here's a workaround. I mean, the first blog post had some pretty straightforward things. And the next blog post, I'm actually, there's still a couple more issues I hit in Rules Scala that I actually sort of nerd sniped Fabian into reviewing some of my changes indirectly for that and ended up with a better solution as a result. There's still one corner case where it's like, in this one case, I still want to parse out an apparent name from a canonical name. But
Yeah.
other than that,
Yeah.
the vast majority of cases, you just need to know, like, this is how you're supposed to handle these things. And it's not that hard once you see it done. But yeah, if you don't know about this already and you get that error, that's why I also try to I put a lot of error messages and things in my blog posts, in my commit messages, pull requests. So if somebody hits that and searches for it, they'll get a hit and go, oh, okay. Here's something helpful that will allow me to move on.
Yeah, I feel like maybe another quick mental trick, useful concept is that labels and strings are different objects, and to convert between them takes a little bit of care. And usually like the @ sign shows up because you have a string version, but if you use the label constructor, that changes the context in which the string is interpreted, usually in the right way.
Yeah.
There was also, I'll just put on the screen for a second, they added a new API into the native namespace in Starlark, or in Bazel's version of Starlark, which is called package relative label. And that's another way that you can avoid having to reference the repository name, right?
Right. Yeah. I haven't used that one in particular, but I think that one of the important rules of thumb with label is if you're in a macro and you're referencing something in your own repository, use a label. Because that way that string will be anchored to the repository in which the macro appears. Otherwise, it will be interpreted as relative to the repository in which the macro is executed, and that's not always what you want.
Yeah, exactly. That's the one that I think when you think of label equals string, then you'll get that one wrong, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe compatibility.
And tool chains. Sorry. Go ahead.
Well, I was going to say compatibility level is another one. This came up in the rules author SIG meeting last week. Or I guess this week. So in theory, modules on the central registry can indicate both the minimum and maximum version of their dependencies. And so there should be a constraint solution that allows us to get the right versions of things. But every now and then when there's a breaking change, someone pulls out this compatibility level flag from Bzlmod. But the result of that is that the end user is just told, oh, sorry, like your dependencies are unsolvable, fix it yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a hard problem, but it's where semantic versioning came from. And of course, part of whether or not semantic versioning is effective is whether people honor the semantic versioning schema, where breaking changes result in a major number bump. And in the Bzlmod world, you have that concept of compatibility level. And so when the dependencies are resolved between modules, the compatibility level is sort of like a super major number, right? Like, so you can have different versions of a module that have different major SymVer numbers, but if they're listed compatibility level 1, you're still going to resolve to the highest version of that. And I hit that problem with Rules Scala with regards to the protobuf module. And I think that protobuf actually does bump its SymVer major appropriately, but all of the modules now available all the way back to 21.7 to 28.3 are compatibility level 1. And so when I was also doing the Bzlmod work on Rules Scala, I was like, you know what? People are going to integrate this. They're probably going to have newer versions of protobuf. I wonder what that will do. And it blew things up. And I have an issue. I linked it in the show notes where I did this whole investigation. It actually took me, weeks of troubleshooting and figuring things out. Where I have the constraints, like if Rules Scala does this, we can handle this version of protobuf. If it goes this, we can go to this version, but we drop that version. And so that's where my concern comes in with compatibility level, is that it's not yet something that is utilized for its intended purpose, to say, and I think it was it Brentley in the rule sig meeting said you should bump it if increasing, if updating the dependency breaks your build. And it's like, yeah, exactly. That's what I would expect from it. I understand that maybe other problems happen after you try to actually run what you built or whatever. But if somebody pulls in rule Scala and then bumps up their protobuf to 28.3, and we don't have our internal jars that can talk to that version of the proto compiler, that's a problem. Whereas if we had different compatibility levels for those protobuf versions, it seems like, well, rule Scala gets up to this version and the main repo gets this other version. And maybe there's still problems after that, but at least there's some signal that there's an incompatibility there.
Yeah, let's wrap up in a couple minutes here. Is there any of these other warts or downsides of Bzlmod that you want to let people know?
Let me see. I'm looking at my notes. I wrote a whole bunch of stuff in advance, and I know I've kind of been weaving in and out.
Yeah, that's
I think yeah. I'm trying to do what I can to expose the problems people might face, provide solutions they have to do with their own hands, provide workarounds until things are fixed upstream. And of course, in the case of rule Scala, I'm trying to do the right thing and actually go upstream and do what I can to help improve that. But things like compatibility level and repository names, we shouldn't depend on them, but a lot of people depend on them in a lot of different projects. So until everybody gets with the program and either handles them correctly or dependencies are upgraded, we just need to be aware that that's going to be a very, very common stumbling point for a lot of people trying to migrate. And then, of course, module.bazel.lock. I really want to like it, but it just seems to be begging to get ignored most of the time up to this point. It just creates a lot of it doesn't seem to lock anything, right? Like Bazel will change it every time it runs, and I understand why it's there and what it's supposed to support, but in practice it really does just generate like monster diffs and merge conflicts. So I'm really kind of on the fence whether to recommend it actually get checked in or not. Personally, in practice, I haven't encountered a problem with Git ignoring it, but I don't want to do that.
Yeah, in theory, it provides some guarantees that Git ignoring it will lose, but I think it's practical for most folks to Git ignore it right now. It's still improving. I think we mentioned that on the episode with Fabian. And yeah, there's and we mentioned that Bzlmod is kind of an abstraction that goes on top of native package managers. And if your native package manager already had a lock file, so you have a locked requirements or a npm lock file, as I recall, one of the fixes we were still working on was that there's a thing where Bzlmod can trust that thing is up to date, and so it doesn't have to relock more than it needs to.
Yeah. But yeah, I guess, just sort of wrap up and end on a positive note. Like I said, I'm fascinated by this work. I think it's definitely driving in the right direction. I want to do whatever is within my power to help everybody make migration and use this wonderful new system. And to bring it back to my own personal sense of motivation, I feel like better builds are the foundation for better code quality. And that's my thing that I really care about. I got my mug is faded, but somebody got for my birthday, little 99 bugs in the code, take one down, patch it around 256 little bugs, right? Like, that's the world I live in, where I want to avoid those kind of problems. And I see, moving towards Bzlmod and having cleaner, faster, more efficient builds as a huge important prerequisite for getting people to care about code quality automated testing. Because yes, more people are testing, but how are they testing? Now that's the next phase of the challenge.
Well, maybe that will be the next episode. I would love to talk about that one too. I'm also, I think a lot of us who use Bazel do it because we're passionate about code quality, and getting this next year from Bazel 8, it's going to drop soon, and getting to Bazel 9 when WORKSPACE is actually deleted, all that code is going to go away. we've got to get the ecosystem to come with us. So please, I would beg everyone to follow Mike's example and contribute upstream. Contribute doesn't have to mean you send awesome pull requests. It could just mean well-formed issues, answering other people's issues. And it can also mean getting your company to donate some money. That we have an open collective that helps, at least for the rules that are in the Bazel Contrib org. Donate some, ask your manager, can I donate some time to this project? Like, let me actually carve out 20% time, or give me like 1 day a week for the next 2 months. I want to go fix this thing. And yes, together we'll do it. We'll fix all the code. We'll fix all the bugs. You can get a new mug that says they're all fixed.
Yes. Well,
right.
Yeah, maybe that's the trick. It's fading. By the time it's totally blank, we'll have solved the problem.
Yes, hopefully. Although AI is writing a lot of new code with bugs, so that could be another episode. I'm sorry to end. We were ending on a positive note. This is great.
Yes, positive.
You so much. Thank you so much for coming on. Really appreciate your depth of expertise and getting to chat with you.
Yeah, really appreciate the opportunity, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Okay, sure thing. See you all next time. Okay, and we're out. Sorry, it took me a while to find